Welcome to It Starts Within, a podcast from Platinum Performance, where we'll dive into the health challenges faced by veterinarians and horse owners alike. Join us for inspiring stories about the latest advancements in equine care, treatments, and comebacks. You'll hear interviews with elite competitors, innovative researchers, and the veterinarians that devote their lives to horses and the humans that love them. At Platinum Performance, we know the power of nutrition starts within. Hello, all, and welcome to the Platinum Performance Podcast. I'm Jessie Bengoa, and today I have with me the great and the wonderful Dr. Matt Durham. Hi, Dr. Durham, and thank you for joining me on the podcast today, sir.
Hi, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Always my pleasure. And now, for most of you, you've heard Dr. Durham speak quite a bit on this show. He's kind of a fan favorite. But for anyone new to us, Dr. Durham is a widely respected equine veterinarian, but he's also board certified in sports medicine and rehabilitation. And he was a practitioner who spent over 20 years in private practice treating very high level sport horses. And interestingly enough, he was a platinum client throughout that entire time. But several years back, the stars aligned, and we were lucky enough for Dr. Durham to join our team here at Platinum. So he is our resident senior equine veterinarian on our team. And lucky for me, we get to have him on the podcast often to share his wide-ranging expertise. And today is no different. But this topic today is sort of near and dear to Dr. Durham's heart. Another fun fact about him is, and really one that's pertinent to what we're going to talk about today, is that he attended farriery school prior to attending veterinary school. So he has a particular passion for all things podiatry, farriery, and I think everything related to the equine foot in general. Am I wrong, sir?
No, it's true. I mean, the saying's trite, but it is for a reason. No hoof, no horse. It's critical.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. And, at Platinum, we are very proud to support the American Farriers Association and the International Hoof Care Summit and all of these amazing farriers that are out there every day, bent over with our horses' hooves on their mind, on their heart, and really helping us to keep them as sound as possible to do what we love to do with them. And it is no small feat, no pun intended. So now, Dr. Durham, I've been in the audience one or two times at least to hear you give a really interesting talk that you referred to as food for the soul, meaning how do we nourish and support our horses' hooves for maximum success? And I feel like what a lot of us riders don't necessarily fully realize is how dependent hooves are on the right nutrition, but also how nutrition can support the surrounding structures that are so intricately connected to the hoof. I mean, we're talking the navicular region, the flexor tendons, P1, P2, P3, and these other bony structures, in addition to the sole, the hoof wall, etc. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Durham and ask him to talk to me about the relationship between nutrition in general and the hoof and these surrounding structures, and what we may or may not know about how important it is in maintaining and supporting this area of the anatomy. And together, we're going to kind of walk through the ABCs of what these key elements are, why they're important, and really how to tackle feeding your horse for optimal hoof health. So, Dr. Durham, the hoof capsule itself, it poses some interesting challenges because really it's makeup. I mean, I remember the great Dr. Steve O'Grady referring to it as, I'm working within a box every day. You have a very tightly encapsulated area surrounded by a hard candy shell, the hoof wall. And that can pose some interesting challenges, no?
Yeah. I mean, I think they talk about in biology that when something gets more complicated, it's usually more highly refined and specialized. So, for example, if you look at a camel's foot, the the hoof wall essentially is like a little tiny claw. They're mainly using their digital cushion. In horses, the digital cushion is important, but it's much less complex than it is in the camel. In the camel, they rely on that. But in the horse's hoof, we have so many of these really, um, as you said, they're all tightly packed in there. But in particular, the laminar structure, the lamina just means fold, and when you think of it, it's essentially like this really long sheet, 2 sheets together, and then they're just folded over and over and over again. Those are the primary folds, and then there are these secondary folds, secondary laminae or secondary lamella, and all that's doing is creating surface area in the horse's hoof. So it's able to withstand these tremendous forces that the horse places on the foot, even comparing it to cattle hooves, which are more similar to horse hooves than in a camel, those are still less complicated. And when you think about the job of the hoof, if we take a step back to think of the overall horse, one of the amazing things when you look at them is how intensely muscular they are, right? They're just these massive powerhouses, but then their legs look really spindly. And the reason is really there's not a lot of muscle on the limbs, in the gaskin, in the hind leg, in the forearm. Below that, there's really very little muscle. And when you think about it, it's advantageous, right? If you don't have this big, heavy muscle that you have to move around, if everything's sort of tight, if everything's relatively small, then that's more efficient. Think of thoroughbreds, for example. They're notorious for having not the strongest feet in the world. They're very light, and good quality thoroughbred feet do their job well, but it's at the sort of like everything in racing, right? Everything's sort of right at the edge of pushing it to its maximum capacity. So when you think of the role of the hoof, it has to be lightweight, it has to provide traction, it has to be flexible, and it has to regrow. And that's really one of the keys when we think about nourishing the foot is that really we're nourishing these cells that are rapidly turning over. And to me, one of the most important factors is that when you talk about different structures in the body and the metabolic rates they have, we know that the brain, the kidneys, certain structures use a lot of energy, right? They're constantly going. Other organs use those more intermittently or at a low level. The hoof, especially at the coronary band and in the sole, has actually a very high metabolic rate. It actually is using energy constantly. And so that brings up the fact that we need to, of course, fuel the horse. And a lot of what we do when we're feeding a horse is, of course, just fuel. Uh, but I think nutrition really needs to go beyond just thinking about food just as fuel. That really there's so many on-off switches within cells that we can influence, in particular with when it comes to things that might be a bit deficient. But in terms of energy, one of the key things really is that if a horse isn't getting enough energy, then we know what ends up happening is that that energy has to go somewhere. The molecules of food that are needed for the body are going to go to the critical structures. And often what that means is that the hoof quality suffers. I One interesting thing is that, hoof is almost identical to hair. Essentially, all of the horn tubules that make the hoof are essentially very much like a hair, as it's growing down. The difference is, uh, each of those has a little papillae, which is this little bundle of nerves and blood vessels that supplies this. It has to, you know, do like it would any in skeletal muscle with oxygen and CO2 exchange with glucose and other energy and then of course the amino acids, all the minerals, all the vitamins, all of that has to come into play as well. Uh, but the difference is that in hair, of course, each follicle produces one hair. But in the hoof, there's also the cells that are between them that create this intertubular substance. And ultimately, the majority of the hoof is keratin, so a type of protein. The There can be a whole talk on types of keratin because keratin is not one type. There are many different forms of keratin within the hoof itself. For example, think of how pliable a normal frog should be compared to the hoof wall. Both of those contain keratin. Um, Partly, one of the things that we'll probably talk about a bunch of times today is these disulfide bonds. So the disulfide bonds create these really strong linkages within keratin molecules and between keratin molecules. And in doing that, they create both the resilience, the springiness. That's mainly the disulfide bonds within one keratin molecule, but also the rigidity, and that's from the disulfide bonds between different molecules. That intertubular cement substance is really critical for maintaining hoof health. But back to the energy story, I get distracted easily. The
He's very passionate, can you tell, folks? I mean, this is a big deal.
the ultimately the if a horse is undernourished, then the body has to make some sacrifices. And one of the main things, obviously, uh, keratin being a protein that's made of amino acids. And if the body isn't getting enough amino acids, it'll break down muscle, it'll utilize them for all of the essential purposes, but but it will deprive the hoof factory, so to speak, of those important ingredients for making more hoof. So that's where the one of the first things to think about in a lot of times we want to focus on, you know, biotin gets all the love. Uh, and biotin's very important and has been studied a lot, but biotin in isolation won't fix abnormal feet, particularly in a horse that's not getting enough energy to begin with, because it's going to be breaking down its own body in order to provide energy to it to sustain. So sometimes just the energy level may not be enough, but then of course that the next topic is protein. Because keratin is protein, it requires these amino acids. And the interesting thing, we talk about a protein requirement for horses. And ultimately, you could argue that horses don't have a protein requirement, but an amino acid requirement. I think if if you think of shoe leather, for example, as a, you know, extreme example, obviously, please don't feed your horse shoe leather. Uh, but shoe leather is uh, mainly protein. It's, you know, it's approaching 100% protein. So great, right? But it's not bioavailable. And it's mostly collagen, which is great, but it doesn't have the sulfur containing amino acids. We've already talked about disulfide bonds. There's where the sulfur containing amino acids come in. If you don't have enough of those, you're not creating those strong bonds. So in particular, the ones that we mainly think about when you're looking at what's in the hoof, cysteine is really the main one. And some biologists with maybe a bad sense of humor, I don't know, decided to name cysteine and cysteine uh, almost identically. So essentially, if you have two molecules of cysteine with an E, I won't make you spell it, uh, it becomes cysteine without an E. So talking about it then becomes very complicated. Now, the way those two molecules bond together is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, disulfide bonds. That disulfide bond that makes it so strong within the hoof is also what makes it relatively indigestible. So we'll find that you either have to have a special form of cysteine, or we'll use a different amino acid, in particular methionine. DL-methionine is a sulfur-containing amino acid that's a bit of a chameleon, so it can turn into all sorts of different things, and in particular, cysteine. So by providing enough methionine, we can really do that. One of the other main ones to call out is lysine. Lysine is thought to be one of the main sort of rate limiting amino acids, because in order to make a protein, the body links these amino acids in a particular order, uh, following a recipe to make this particular molecule. And if the lysine isn't available, then that molecule can't be made, or it's not made properly. So lysine tends to be one of the few things that will even show up on a Hay evaluation, some on a good one. And that's something that needs to be really evaluated. So when you think about the quality of proteins, this is where it becomes really apparent. And of course, using our extreme example that no one's going to do, if we were just feeding shoe leather, we would meet the protein requirement, but we wouldn't meet the amino acid requirements for two reasons. One, the mixture of the amino acids, and the bioavailability of those amino acids. So that becomes really important, the main source of those amino acids, but also the mixture. So there are times where horses are actually getting more protein than they need, and but they may not have that correct mix. So that's something to really consider.
Yeah, 100%. And, I know you talk a lot about a lot of riders being under the impression that they're feeding to NSC guidelines. And you're saying, yes, absolutely. But that keeps horses alive. That is the only goal with that, to keep horses alive. Now let's talk about how to make them thrive and how to support them as athletes and for their long term, and this is a hot topic always at Platinum, is longevity, durability. These are the actual goals that we need to be striving for, and hooves are such a central point to that because they literally support everything above it, tip to tail. The hooves are the foundation, and so we really do
Yeah.
to pay attention and know as riders that it goes so far beyond biotin. We understood that for a long time because of marketing people like me, but it goes far beyond biotin, and it's very important. And, amino acids are such a hot topic in human medicine these days too. I mean, you hear so much about protein powders and this and that, but really the amino acids is where it all starts in terms
Yeah.
of protein
Right.
and really what the body needs, and in this case, what the hooves need. And
Mhm.
so I want to zero in a little bit further because that was fascinating. As always with amino acids and protein, I feel like they're very misunderstood in a lot of ways. Um, but talk to me a little bit about fats, because fats are interesting, when it comes to the hoof, hard hair, as we like to joke and call it. But
Yeah.
fats are an interesting thing. And they do come into play pretty heavily with the hoof. So talk to me a little bit about that, and what matters there.
Yeah, for me, it comes in sort of two main ways. And one, since we're kind of talking about the "you are what you eat"
Yep.
part,
Yep.
fats are incorporated into the hoof itself. And the in particular, that intertubular cementing substance, a lot, up to, 3, 5% of the hoof is fat. And it one of the prime, roles that it plays is in, as a moisture barrier. So one of the things when you if you look really closely at the cross section of a hoof, you'll notice that the tubules, as they get towards the outer hoof wall, are smaller and they're more tightly packed together. And then as they get closer to the sensitive tissues, they're bigger and a little further apart. And the moisture level sort of follows that. It's driest on the outside and has the most moisture towards the inside where the vital tissues are, the dermal tissues with the blood vessels and nerves and all that. Fats play a big part in, preventing moisture from getting in from the outside. Essentially, we know that, wet feet, if the moisture is able to get in and get in between those tubules, things start to break down and crack and look really kind of gross. Um, that, moisture barrier from fat does a really important job in terms of maintaining that section. It also is thought to provide some of the flexibility of the hoof wall as well.
So
But
interesting. But and Dr. D, I want you in the to talk about really, we know that the right fats
yeah,
can support inflammation, the body's natural defenses against inflammation, or rather, maintaining these more healthy and more normal inflammatory pathways. And I feel like the hoof is so interesting on the inflammatory component because everywhere else in the body, um, you can see edema, you can see swelling, you can
yeah.
see inflammation with your eyes some of the time,
Mhm,
unless
mhm.
we're
Yeah.
talking about the systemic inflammation that lives beneath the surface. But the hoof is so unique because there's nowhere to go, and that's when you're dealing with some of these disease states within the hoof. That's why it can be so problematic, is because it does have this hard candy shell where when there is inflammation going on, there's no
Well,
for it to expand.
yeah, the same thing happens with the brain when there's edema in the brain. If you get kicked in the leg, your thigh gets bigger, but your brain gets bigger and there's nowhere left to go. So then there's essentially pressure from both sides. And yeah, the same thing can happen within the hoof for sure. Yeah, the second part of the story of why fats are so important, besides the structural component, is in terms of just cellular health in general. And as you said, I think I used to always think of inflammation as, inflammation bad, no inflammation good. And uh, really, that's not accurate at all, right? We want to have a balanced, functional immune system that's capable of attacking bacteria or viruses or dealing with an injury or with cancer. Uh, we don't want it to overreact to those things, but we also want it to be ready to react. So I think it's important to remember that, horses are grazing animals, and those two essential fatty acids, the linoleic and alpha linolenic, I'll just say LA and ALA, uh, they're both essential fatty acids. They're both essential for healthy hoof. And one of the things that I think gets overlooked is the fact that the omega-6 fatty acid, LA, in horses, it's very rare for that to be deficient. You a horse would have to be eating a really crazy diet uh, for that deficiency to happen. So for the most part, we don't need to augment that. Whereas with omega-3 fatty acids, we know that they're present in fresh green grass. Uh, Obviously, we use a lot of flaxseed meal because it's very rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and in particular, the ALA. Um, But we know, and living in California, right now things are green, but they're starting to turn that little yellowy green, and pretty soon they'll be golden. We don't like to say brown; it's golden. But the important thing is, if you're feeding cattle, if you're feeding horses, and there's 2.5 feet of dormant yellow grass, the nutrition is still good for the most part, but a lot of things are depleted from that. And one of the things that depletes is omega-3 fatty acids. Those are also, of course, depleted when we cut hay. Those levels will drop off pretty quickly. And then some of the things that we'll talk about in a bit, I'm sure, a lot of the vitamins are also depleted in that dormant grass. So what that means is that it's very common for there to be an imbalance between the omega-3 and the omega-6. Normally, if you look at the variability of most grass pastures, there's a ratio of, if you're looking at it from the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio, that direction, 1 omega-6 to anywhere between 2 to up to 7. So usually, I think most people use an average of 1 to 4. So normally, horses should be getting about 4 of the ALA, the omega-3, to every omega-6. And if they're on yellow grass, if they're eating hay, even good quality hay, within 6 weeks or so, the levels drop really dramatically. So uh, the important thing is that that balance really is important. And again, as you mentioned, for the inflammatory cascade, we want to keep that in balance. So is all do we want to eliminate omega 6s from the diet? It would be impossible to do that. But the problem is it's very easy to over amplify the omega 6 fatty acids. Grains tend to be quite high in omega 6 fatty acids. And one of the things that I actually had used for a while was corn oil, because it's cheap and it's, energy rich. And we could say, oh, we could give you some extra calories here. What I didn't really realize is that by overemphasizing those omega-6 fatty acids, we can create, and this is measurable, you can actually create a situation where you're emphasizing the inflammatory part of the cascade. So what we really want to do with by sort of reprogramming the body's what the body sees in terms of omega-3 fatty acids to bring that more into equilibrium. And we find that horses do really well that way. And I think it's clear when you look at a horse that's on platinum on any of the wellness formulas, their hair coat looks really good. And as you mentioned earlier, hooves are essentially hard hair. They grow from the same stuff, they use the same ingredients. The cells that create them are very similar. So I think, knowing what's going on there, and there was a study in Malaysia that looked at different feeds, at different barns, and they measured the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acid content in, both in the rations and in the blood of all the horses, and they made a hair quality index. And, uh like I had mentioned earlier, the omega-6 fatty acid content was uniform throughout all of these diets. It didn't really change, but the omega-3 fatty acid content did. And the ones that had a good level of omega-3 fatty acids had had the best quality hair quality score, and which isn't a surprise to anyone who's fed platinum. And the ones that had low levels had poor hair quality score. I wish they had also evaluated hooves in that study, but the hair quality in hoof, you know, again, it is very similar. And I've had farriers tell me that just being on the Platinum Wellness formula really does a lot of that. And of course, that goes beyond just the omega-3 fatty acids that are in it, because when Dr. Earthell was coming up with that, he was really, I love that he thought of it as pasture in a bucket, because what we've talked about is that a lot of these things deplete, and that you can't always rely on some of the trace minerals, some of those essential amino acids to be at the proper levels. So by having that on board as well, I guess for me, one of the things about hoof nutrition, you'll hear some people say, well, it's really rare for a horse to ever be low on X, Y, or Z. And most of the time, that's probably true. But some of these ingredients are quite important, and they do tend to drift below our optimal levels. And again, I think if we think of the coronary band as a hoof factory that's working 24/7, if you've ever seen the fever ring on a horse after they've been sick, that's a real thing. Why did it happen? Because the factory wasn't working very well at that point. All those cells were malfunctioning. So for me, the idea is, let's keep those cells as healthy as possible, provide them any substrate they might need at all times so that we're not having any of those disruptions in the hoof quality. The fever ring is a pretty dramatic shift because it's this thing that hits them pretty hard all at once. But what's more common is this sort of insidious thing that happens over time where the hoof is pretty good, but not all the way good. And then as it grows down and is exposed to the weather and the rasp and dirt and all that, it needs to start off as strong as possible so that when it meets the ground surface about a year later in a lot of horses at the toe, that still holds as much integrity as possible. And we know that a lot of that comes from the mineral content. The minerals that provide, they actually, in particular, we think of, the zinc and copper. They sort of go hand in hand. And these two are really important for a whole array of important molecules. One that we don't necessarily emphasize when we're thinking of hooves is the superoxide dismutase. That's a big scary word, but it's essentially one of the most important antioxidants that the body uses inside cells. And it's reliant on the copper and the zinc in order for it to actually be a functional molecule. But copper and zinc also play important roles in helping to create those disulfide bonds and in cell turnover and all sorts of mechanisms that are really important. Um, one of the ones that is in platinum hoof support that people will ask, well, so what's this about, is the cobalt is essential for the body to make vitamin B12. And essentially the body actually doesn't make it. It's back to that microbiome inside the colon. The colonic contents, the microbes will make vitamin B12 if they have cobalt. So uh, vitamin B12, most of the B vitamins are really important for energy. So essentially, they help the body to utilize energy. uh, Vitamin B12 is important for red blood cell creation. But one of the other things that B12 does that's really important is that it helps cells replicate. And that's one of the things that happens at the coronary band at a high rate, again, because it's creating a new cell, filling it with keratin, and pushing it down, and then creating a new cell. And then each one, as it's pushed down, becomes that hoof wall. So B12 ends up being really kind of an important molecule for a lot of different things. On the B vitamins, of course, that's where biotin comes in, and biotin is one that has been studied quite a bit, and most of the studies do show a benefit to biotin, but there are definitely studies that show that if a horse has really poor feet and all you supplement is biotin, you might not uh, get what you want. You might not get that really healthy, strong hoof that you want. And of course, when you think about it, it makes sense, right? If we have a deficiency on one hand, there might be other deficiencies. And if we plug one hole, we're not solving the other problems as well. So that's where I think people will often say, "Oh, my horse's hooves don't look as good as I want. He needs biotin."
Yeah.
Maybe, but we can't ignore those other ingredients. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just fascinating. They're all interwoven, right?
yeah,
So it is not one component that impacts the hoof, which makes sense, just like it isn't one component that turns a suboptimal body healthy.
mhm,
So there's all of these different things, the fats, the amino acids and the proteins, the vitamins, the minerals,
yeah,
all working in concert together. And it reminds me of something that we hear quite a bit at Platinum where it's like, hey, why don't you have, the highest possible level of biotin, highest possible level of, hyaluronic acid or MSM, pick
mhm,
something.
yeah,
And I feel like one of the areas that Dr. Herthel, our founder, we keep talking about him, but he's just
mhm,
so central to who we are.
yeah,
One of the things that he really cracked the code on so many years ago and really understood is this synergistic effect, right? Is if
yeah,
all of these nutrients in the correct ratios
yeah,
working in concert with one another for maximum benefit to support the horse in an optimal way. And I think it goes back to a couple different things. And one is the form of these
yeah,
nutrients. We've talked a lot about all these different nutrients, but what we haven't mentioned is that there's several forms of many of them, and
yeah,
making sure that you get the most bioavailable or absorbable form of these nutrients is so imperative. And, in our
mhm,
business, we see that there's, like in so many, right? There's quality and there's something else that's out there available. And typically when something is really, extremely inexpensive in comparison, I always caution horse owners when it looks too good to be true, it usually is, and the
yeah,
things that you wanna pay attention to are, what form are you feeding your horse, and is it the most bioavailable, safe, tested form? Because these nutrients, are things that are designed to support horses, and have an effect,
yeah,
and so you wanna make sure that you're doing the safe thing and you're doing the bioavailable thing. And
yeah,
then another point that I really wanna emphasize is something that you said a little bit earlier because I found it fascinating and I didn't know it, which I should have. As a horse person before I came to Platinum, I should have known and I didn't fully appreciate. You said something about how nutrients so quickly drop once we harvest hay
mhm,
and bale hay. And
yeah,
most of us are not feeding fresh out of the pasture hay. Sometimes, sure, but most of us not. Um, and we're talking massive drops in a very short period
yeah,
of time. So between 6 and 10 weeks, we're seeing anywhere between a 70 and a 90% drop in omega-3 fatty acids, which is mind blowing. I mean, this is what we're after.
and the vitamin
And
E,
vitamin E.
yeah, all a lot of these, and the other vitamins too, um, yeah, that I think that's a it's we sort of think, "Oh, well, we're feeding what they would be eating if they were grazing." And yes, but, and in particular, those molecules are really important. Again, we talked about the omega 3s. Vitamin E for me is one of the critical ones, and it's not always talked about in terms of hoof health, but One of the important things about antioxidants is there are different forms of free radicals. So there are different types of antioxidant that are necessary. We already talked about superoxide dismutase. That's the superoxide radical. But other free radicals, vitamin E is actually, it does a great job because it has sort of two components to its molecule. One that looks like a fatty acid and one that looks like it's that's capable of doing its job, so it can incorporate into cell membranes. And it's really good. One of the things that can happen when you have free radicals is this sort of chain reaction that goes across a cell membrane, affecting those fatty acids as it goes. Vitamin E is really good at breaking that cycle. And one important thing to remember is that one molecule of vitamin E can address one free radical. Once it's addressed that free radical, it's not active vitamin E anymore. And this is where the whole interaction between all the different antioxidants comes in, because vitamin C is one that can actually rejuvenate it. Vitamin C, of course, in us is an essential vitamin. If we don't eat it, we get scurvy, which is fortunately very rare now. But
Let's talk more
now
about
that
that,
we've
folks.
now that we have figured out to take limes with us on our ships and all, uh, but horses make their own vitamin C. So you'll often read, we don't, why are we even talking about vitamin C? Horses make vitamin C. But I think that there are a couple important points to add on to that. And one is uh, older horses, in particular with PPID, have been shown to have lower levels. And there's also the thought that if you have an imbalance, if you have an over exaggeration of free radicals, then you have an increased need, and maybe you're not making enough. Or certainly with some other diseases, we don't necessarily know if there's adequate vitamin C. This is one that we know is safe and is going to be excreted, in the urine. It's water soluble vitamin. So, uh, adding that in where we're concerned about free radicals, then giving an antioxidant like vitamin C along with vitamin E is not a bad thing.
Well, and that's, it's one of the reasons, obviously, we believe so strongly in our foundation formulas, and that's why we keep going back to them. And we talk a lot to clients when they call, or the Platinum Advisor team does, is like, yes, absolutely. Does Platinum Hoof support hooves, the way that really that was our goal? Yes, 100%. It's wonderful. Do we strongly believe that it adds more correct support if combined with a foundation formula? Yes, we do. And this is why, these essential fatty acids, these omega-3 fatty acids that horses have to consume to get
Mhm.
adequate quantities. And, we've been talking about how hay can very oftentimes be so deficient in them,
Yeah.
and then these antioxidants. And I always think of antioxidants as man on man defense. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Picture a boxing match, like
Yeah.
you've got to have one antioxidant to every free radical, just like you said. Otherwise, you're going to get KO'd. It's not going to work out
Yeah.
very well. And
Well,
so it's important.
yeah, when you think about just cell function, if you have, a cell that's trying to do a job, whether it's a muscle cell that's, contracting, or an oocyte that's trying to, hopefully become a new foal, or a hoof cell that's trying to create new protein. If it's having to spend a lot of its energy trying to fight off antioxidants, then that, because the other thing about free radicals is they affect the fatty acids in the cell membrane. They affect protein. They can degrade proteins, and they have an effect on DNA. Free radicals can cause mutations in DNA that can be, obviously, in the worst case scenario, turn into cancers. So we know that uh, combating free radicals is certainly a worthwhile thing. And, even back to the NRC points out that vitamin E should be elevated in horses that are exercising more because we know that more free radicals are made because they're burning so much oxygen in muscle. Uh, the 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 NRC guidelines are still sort of the best we have, but I think it's important to remember that that last edition is 20 years old. So I think we've learned more since then, some nuances, um, but still, and in particular, the recommendations on omega-3 fatty acids, on vitamin E, and on the type and form of some of the minerals, uh, and that depending on the form, you might not need the same amount if it's more bioavailable. So there are some things in that document that I think it'll be really it's
Yeah.
it's due for an upgrade.
Yes.
Um, but Jesse, there's one thing that I wanted to talk about that I think fits with a couple of the things you said. And one is that, like, you were sort of talking about well, why don't you have more of this? And I think one of the things that you were sort of talking about is that Doug thought, well, more isn't always more.
Yeah.
More isn't always better. And for me, one of the key ingredients that fits that perfectly is selenium. And selenium is really important for hoof. And it's one of those minerals that has this really narrow therapeutic window where it's doing the right job. And what causes that is actually very interesting. And it gets back to our old friend, the amino acid cysteine. So cysteine, if you substitute the sulfur with a selenium, it becomes selenocysteine. And that is a really important amino acid for antioxidants, in particular glutathione peroxidase, which is one of the main functioning antioxidants in the cell. Again, there are lots of selenoproteins, and pretty much all of them have a selenocysteine at one part of it. So what's very interesting is that cysteine becomes important both for deficiency and for excesses. The reason is if you don't have enough selenocysteine, then you don't make enough glutathione peroxidase. You can't protect the cells. And this can lead to really poor cellular function. Selenium ends up being important for the thyroid function. What you'll see when levels are low is horses might be a little they're you exercise intolerant without a real explanation, maybe a little grumpy. Their hair coat will start to look funky. In a bay horse, you'll see that had a really pretty coat. You'll see the tips of the hairs are almost like, over processed, like they're almost sort of orangish and thin and raggedy. And that I think is a reflection of what's going on in the hooves too. On the flip side of that, if there's too much selenium, the same thing happens. And where those disulfide bonds need to form, if too much of the cysteine that's incorporated into the hoof is selenocysteine, then those disulfide bonds don't form and you get quite a bit of weakness in the foot. So to me, selenium is a really interesting molecule. It's one that can be deficient depending on because it's incorporated into the forage based on how much is in the soil. So there are certain areas of the U.S. that have pretty low levels. Some have overly high levels, and there are some weeds that will concentrate it. Um, the more common cause of selenium over supplementation is through stacking supplements. And that's why I really always liked having um, platinum as just sort of my base, where I didn't need to add a lot of stuff. And then I would draw blood. And then if the levels are low, we know that this gets back to form again, that if you use the inorganic forms of selenium, they will get in, they will, but you can raise the levels a lot faster, in particular using selenium yeast. It's a very efficient way for the body to bring it into its system and incorporate it.
Yeah. No, it's all so interesting and it sounds so intricate, and that's why people like us are here is to is to help guide you through this labyrinth of nutrients, but they all do play a role. And I think, kind of bringing it home to great, so what should I feed my horse? I'm concerned about hoof health. I want to make sure I'm either maintaining good quality hooves, excuse me, or I am, working to support my horse in an effort to get to good quality hooves.
Yeah.
And I think, one place that we like to start is total energy or caloric intake, because it does directly correlate to the growth rate of hooves. And ensuring a horse is in a positive energy balance is important. Total intake
Yeah.
meets or exceeds total output. And that means your horse is either maintaining or gaining weight if it needs to.
Yeah.
Um, and a horse with really poor quality hooves, we always say, okay, talk to us about what's going in their mouth. What are you feeding them? What does their total energy intake look like? And we always like to remind our clients, listen, it's about nutrient dense quality, nutrient dense calories. You're not wanting to feed empty calories for the sake, excuse me, of feeding them.
Yeah.
And so we always say start with good quality forage. If you're going to do anything, start with good quality forage. Most horses typically don't necessarily require a whole lot of grains and concentrates. If you do want to feed them, make sure you're choosing a quality source and you're keeping it minimal. It's just not the way they were designed to digest, to be fed pounds and pounds and pounds of processed food. And then, great, let's talk about the right supplements. And we typically try to say, let's start with one of the foundation formulas: Platinum Performance Equine, CJ, DJ, GI, and even Platinum Vet Repro Care can really help out these horses. Very often, they don't need to go further than that. That is
Yeah.
supplied with all of these nutrients that Dr. Durham just educated us about. However, horses, just like people, every now and then you get a problem case, right? You've got a horse that just genetically or for whatever reason has crummy hooves. That's the official diagnosis. They've got
Yeah.
crummy hooves. So they're dealing
That's
with,
the scientific
yes,
term.
scientific, very scientific. Write that down. Or they're dealing with something else related to their hooves. And in that case, we will typically add in platinum hoof support. And then we will remind clients that the hoof is in a state of perpetual growth, right? This is growing constantly. And it's a very slow process to grow a hoof out entirely. So we're talking 10 months typically to grow a hoof out. So if you do have a hoof issue, patience is, unfortunately for most of us, not our strong suits, but it is really necessary. And it's something where when you do start to make these gradual changes to your horse's diet, which should be made gradually, when you do start to make those changes, patience is a virtue, and it's something that we constantly check in, see how things are going, but it is something that is going to take several months to really show measurable change in a horse's hoof. And so it's something that, we rely on veterinarians like Dr. Durham and his colleagues, and we rely on your farrier, to be having their hands on that horse's hoof repeatedly. And those two people working together to ensure that your horse is headed in the right direction or maintaining, healthy, wonderful hooves
Yeah.
would obviously be the goal. So, Dr. Durham, any closing thoughts? What say you, sir?
I think the important thing to remember is that we're feeding more than just I Dr. Ethel always said we're not just feeding a 1,000-pound animal or feeding trillions of cells. And I think we think of hoof health in terms of, are we making the stuff? But I think the fever line to me is such a great reminder that the health of the cell directly affects the quality of the hoof that it's able to produce. And there's so many times where I think the nutrition is adequate, they're not losing weight, they're just okay. And we can optimize that to a point where we can make sure that there aren't any gaps that need to be filled, and make sure that the hoof quality is optimized to its maximum so that when it does make that full 10-month journey, that it's in the best shape it can be to help protect the the inner the inner parts of that foot.
Absolutely, and, there's so many similarities between horses and people, and in people, when you get hair analysis testing done, it's like a roadmap. It tells a story, and it's the same thing in horses with the hoof. It really can tell a story. And it's nice to know that there's certain nutrients and avenues that we can take to better support hooves. So whether they're amazing and healthy and strong and wonderful, or whether they could really use some help,
Yeah.
there's some avenues to take and some things that can be done to more naturally support those hooves, really for long term health, soundness, longevity, all the things, because hooves really are incredibly important. And like I said earlier, organizations like the AFA or American Farriers Association and International Hoof Care Summit, um, they're doing a lot to try and educate on these topics, and it's wonderful. And I love to see how closely and how more closely veterinarians and farriers are working together these days to take a team approach, a 1-2 punch, for the sake of the horse. And ultimately, it's the horse that benefits from that. So it's great. So use your resources, use your farrier, use your veterinarian, and rely on that expertise. And in the meantime, we're here to help on all of these nutrients
Yeah.
and how to make the complicated simple for the sake of the horse. So, Dr. Durham, I really appreciate your time today, as
Oh,
always,
yeah.
my friend.
That's great. Yeah. It's a great topic.
It really is a great topic. I mean, it's, who knew? Who knew we can go down the rabbit hole for a lot longer than we actually did today on hooves, but, and for those of you listening, we really do appreciate you spending your time with us and learning alongside me from the best, like Dr. Durham. And I hope you came away today with something that you can apply to your own horses, like I said, to get those durable, sound, healthy athletes for the long term. So, from all of us at Platinum, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Jessie Bengoa, and until next time, take care, y'all.